Alright, howdy, hey ladies and gentlemen. I am going to be doing some Unity programming, just like a basic tutorial of some of the core foundations of programming, and I want to go over some of it. I'm going to go over some of the basic variables and some of the core functionality and what they do. But let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to open up Unity. I'm using Unity 5.6. It does have collab. I'm not going to go over anything like that. And then, yeah. Okay. So, with this, I'm going to actually go ahead and start off in 2D mode. I have this scene and project already made. It is a 3D project, but I'm working 2D right now just to show basic control. So let's get started. Let's make an empty game object. You can either go to up here, you can create there, you can right click, go to create here, or you can go up to game object, you can create here. There's many different ways of doing it. Personally, I like to right click because it's faster. And we're going to create an empty game object. So we're going to create, it's going to be a script holder. And each item in the hierarchy is going to be a game object, and you can add components to it to develop the game object. Here we're just going to add a script, nothing too fancy. And we're going to name this the core. Something simple, something easy. Now I have mine opening up in Visual Basic. MongoDevelop also works. Okay, here we go. Alright, so first off, I'm getting rid of all this. Now, there are all different types of functions. The basics, I'm just going to go over, is an integer, and we're just going to give it a name. Then we have the float, and we're just going to call it, actually, I'll just call it temp float. In fact, I'm going to call this temp integer. Now, you can see here, I'm doing a very specific thing. This is the lowercase. The first thing is going to be lowercase. This is for essentially all variables. Variables are what we are going to declare, but the first letter is for the first word is going to be lowercase, and every word after that will be uppercase. Then we have a string. Um, this is going to be for like words or anything like that. And last but not least, we have the famous Boolean. Now, the Boolean is actually just an integer, and booleans usually you can use it. It makes things a lot easier, and I'll go over it a little bit further. But essentially, a boolean is a statement of true or false, and that can be tied with an integer as well. So the first one is an integer. Just like you learned in your math class, an integer is just a whole number. That's pretty much it. It could be negative, it could be zero, it can be positive. It doesn't really matter. So you got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all that. Those are integers. In fact, we're going to actually bring up void start. So let's get started with the integer. The integer is very basic. It can be a negative number, it can be 0, and it can be a positive number. So you can have -1, you can have 0, or you can have a positive 1. So let's say that our integer equals, let's make it 5. And then let's make it do a debug.log. So debug.log is going to display in the console in Unity right here. That's just doesn't matter. So the debug.log is actually going to show here down in the console on play. So because we have it in our void start, I'm going to get rid of that. For some reason, Visual Basic wants to put that every time I start to type in void start. Not sure why. But we have here, we're going to set the integer to 5. So up here, there's many different ways you can run this. You can, up here, set it to 5. Or you can do it in void start. So essentially, this is going to, let's say we set this to 1 up here. Well, on void start, when it starts to run the script, it's going to change the integer up here to 5. The way that I like to program is I set it empty at all times. And then I have the actual, like I run the to set up everything and void start. All right, so if I were to hit play at this point, you set up the integer, you create the variable. Right now it's empty, and then once you hit play, it's going to assign this empty integer variable the value of 5, and then it's going to run it in the console. So if I go ahead and hit play here, boom, there it is. Now it's a lot easier with debug.log. When you have a bunch of these, you can actually say, you can put in some words to kind of help tell you what it's going to be. So yeah. So what this is going to say is it's going to run the debug.log is going to run this string, and then it's going to add on the value of this integer. And debug.log is your greatest friend. There are a million times I will test one little bit at a time. I will create an entire system and program and run everything based off of debug.logs. It does nothing but tell me messages. And when that happens, I know that the system works. So all I have to do is put in my functionality, and the whole system is already done. It's a lot easier, it saves a lot of time and a lot of work. So if we go ahead and hit play, boom, the temp integer variable is 5. So that's an integer. It's very simple, it's very basic. But let's go ahead and go further. So we're going to actually comment this out. There's many different ways you can comment. You can do double slash, that'll get the lines. You could go ahead and do the forward slash asterisk, which is nice. You can actually do things like this with Visual Basic, and oops, it there we go. And it's very simple. You can add extra lines, things like that. For our sake, I'm just going to do the forward slash or the forward double slash. The next one we're going to work on is the float. The float is actually, it's just a decimal version of an integer. So you can go 1.000000001. You know, you can do any kind of decimal. You can do 1.75. The trick about it is you have to put an F afterwards. That helps tell Unity and running through C# and all that is a float. Um, so like I said before, we can set it up here. So we could do 1.75F. Easy. You can see here actually it's gonna call it wrong. But once you put that F, then it knows, hey, that's a float. That's what this digit is for. Anytime, whether you're assigning a float or anything like that, you always, if it's a decimal, you have to put that F. So let's go ahead and assign it. So we're going to go into temp float equals, let's go with 1.75. Oops, there we go, F. And we're going to close that line. So let's go ahead and get that debug.log down here. And we're going to change it here to float, and we're going to change there to float. Now, copying and pasting is always dangerous. There is a lot of human error that can happen there, but when it's something as simple as this, I like to do it. And the one thing that you always want to pay attention to is simplicity is key, always in programming. Once you start trying to get into something fancy, you're going to screw up. But if you keep screwing up and keep screwing up and pushing forward, you eventually find out that if you had taken a simple route, it would have functioned a lot better. You can get some practice. You can actually get to solving the fancy schmancy stuff with programming, which is fantastic. That's always good to do. But with simplicity comes ease, and with ease comes your project coming to fruition, and it's easy to edit later on. Sometimes there's some fancy stuff that you can get into where you're running some functions that solves all this stuff and cuts out a lot of easy stuff, but then later on you want to change one of those easier things and you can't. You have to destroy the whole function and start running some other stuff and rebuild it. I like simplicity. That's my style of programming. Everyone is different. But let's go ahead and save this and let's go test it in Unity. So now it's going to say the temp float variable is 1.75. It's not going to carry the F there because the F kind of gets canceled out with the wording. It's not in there. So that's a float. It's fairly basic. It's very easy. And it's just any kind of numerical value that is less than a whole digit. So any decimals or anything like that. Once you go into decimals, it's a float. That's really all it is. So let's go ahead and get to a string. A string is essentially alphabetical digits. That's really all it is. So a word, any word. It could be, I don't know, something weird if you want to. So let's go ahead and make it something weird. So let's make it temp string equals. Now the thing you want to pay attention to and know with strings is that you've got to put them in quotation marks. Just like we put the F onto the float, the quotation marks lets it know that you're doing a string. So let's go ahead and create a string. So let's say coffee is the greatest thing, this invention since sliced bread. There we go. That's our string. So guess what we're going to do now? We're going to test it. Debug.log is your best friend. And since we're already running a string, we don't need another string here. But what we want to do is make sure we're calling the right variable to debug.log. So, oh, I left it in play mode. All right, there you go. There we go. Coffee is the greatest invention since sliced bread. And yeah, that's a string. It's nice and simple as that. It can say anything that you want. Um, Actually, we can change this. This is going to be a little bit fancier. So the temp, the integer is, there we go. We're going to add that. So we could have actually done this. Temp string plus temp integer. So now we're taking and we're calling this variable, and then we're going to add on this variable. So temp string is, the integer is, and I made sure that there's a space there, and then temp integer is going to be 5. So if we go ahead and save it, and I hold down control and hit S, you'll see the little mouse cursor change in the little blue circle. So if you see that, that's me saving it. I always save before you go into Unity. Otherwise, you're going to get some errors like, hey, this doesn't make sense. What are you doing? Um, that's okay. We're not using that. So let's go ahead and hit play. Like the integer is 5. Yeah, we just combined two of our variables. So it's nice and simple and easy. Now here's where it's going to get really, really fun. So we're going to tie in a bool. Now the bool means true or false. Numerically, it's 0 and 1. Same thing as an integer. That's the fancy fun thing about it. Most of the time, you don't need a Boolean. An integer is going to work just fine, but visually, a Boolean is a lot easier because it's true or false. That's a lot easier to read than 0 and 1 because 0 and 1 can be assigned to anything. 0 could be true and 1 could be false, or 0 could be false and 1 equals true. So Boolean kind of helps decide that. But if you're running a multitude of different things, like, you know, this has to be this at this point, this has to be at this point, this has to be at this point. That's 3 different points of data that you can interchange. So, for example, if the integer is 0, the color of an object is red. If the integer equals 1, the color of the object is blue. If the integer equals 2, then object equals, or the object color is purple. So once you get into more values than 2, that it's either going to be 1 or it's going to be one value and it cannot be the rest. An integer works the best there. That's exactly the same thing as a Boolean. It's a little confusing, but a Boolean is set to two possible outcomes, which is true or false. Um, but we can get into that a whole nother day. So we're going to set the Boolean to false at first. Okay, so we're going to do temp bool equals false. And then we're going to debug.log it. There we go. So if we save it, we go to Unity, we hit play, it's going to tell us it's false. All right, now that's simple. That's all. This is the core foundation. This is the basics. In fact, I'm sure a lot of you guys are bored because you probably already know this, but a little reinforcement never hurts. All right, so now let's do something kind of fancy with all this. What can we do with all this? This is just some basic stuff. Um, let's go ahead and play with the Boolean to make the string equal the integer or the float. So here, if we're going to have things actually running like that, we need to, it does the thing with void update too. We have to do it in void update. Now there's fixed update, that way it's to a fixed frames per second. Update just kind of is willy-nilly, it's just going to do it as fast as it can, um, which can cause some lag and things like that if you got things running when it shouldn't, or it's taking up all the data. In our case, that's not going to be an issue. This is just running some basic stuff. So the temporary boolean is false. So let's put an if statement. This is going to be one of the most important things you're going to learn in programming is the if statement. So let's say, let's go back to that whole integer thing that I was talking about. If the integer equals 0, and I forgot the colors, if the integer equals 0, then set the object to color white. Let's go with that. So that would be like an if statement. So what we want to do is we want to type if, and we want our parameter. Parameter is the parentheses when you're trying to declare something. So what we're trying to declare, maybe not necessarily declare, we're trying to put a statement into it. If or a condition. A condition is what we want to do. So if our condition of temp bool, and when you're putting in a condition, you want two equal signs all the time. Um, or you like you could do greater than, or I'm sorry, less than or equal to. You could do greater than or equal to. You can't just put equals. You have to put two equals when you want it to be exact. When you want this to equal this perfectly. Um, I know that doesn't really make sense, but once you get into numbers and time dot delta time, which you don't need to pay attention to now, unless if you don't know it, um, it can cause some problems if you do equals. But for this, a boolean can only equal true or can only equal false. It's one or the other. So double equals works perfectly fine here. If it is false, then now we want to set up our function, or um, our essentially the guts of what we're trying to do. So right here, so if our boolean is false, then what we want it to do is we want temp string to equal temp integer. Now here's a problem that we're going to face. You can't make one variable equal the other if it's not of the same type. So for example, we can't make a string equal an integer. Now there's many different ways to get around this, but in this case they provided a nice fancy function that lets us get through it. So we can put a dot, and you can see there's a whole bunch of these. But this final one is called toString. Well, this is a string, and we want this integer to become a string. So let's go for it. And then this is a function. It says it's wrong. It's got the nice little red squiggly lines letting you know, hey, something's not right. Well, it's a function, and whenever you declare a function, you need parameters. Some functions have parameters that you got to put into it, but a lot of them are empty. If you're just trying to run a function and there's nothing fancy, you're trying to work with it, then empty parameters is really what it's going to call for. Uh, in this case, you can actually, if you start, see if I can get it. Yeah, here we go. I was going to say 3 overloads. That's kind of confusing, but essentially, if something's going to go inside there, then it'll tell you. So we got vector 3, blah blah blah. I don't really, doesn't really matter. So blah 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 equals new vector 3. So here we go. So it's going to tell you you need a float, you need a comma, and then you need another float. So this function was developed to have multiple different things inside its parameters. But when I get into that stuff, that was just to show you that some functions are empty, some are not. And usually um, it's going to kind of, if you use monodeveloped or Visual Basic, it's going to help you out. So there we go. Now I'm going to show you one other thing. We can create another if statement because we want something for true. So let's have the Boolean. If it's false, it's going to be the integer. If it's true, it's going to be the float. So if temp bool equals true, then temp string equals temp float dot to string. So one of the things that I'm doing, you'll probably see, is if I go like temp, right, and I want the temp bool, if I type a B, then it's going to already highlight. It's already chosen. You can see this is what is going to pop out. So hit the space bar, it'll automatically type it for you. So you can get actually very lazy. That's what I'm doing. That's why it's just popping up as I'm typing. I'm not typing super fast and that there's any lag or frame rate issues. It's that I'm using the system to jump ahead because I'm already done with what I'm trying to type out. And I know that once I hit the space bar or start typing something else, it's going to automatically fill to the correct naming convention and everything. So here we go. We have, if it's false, it's the integer. If it's true, it's the float. Now we want a way to change it. I'm going to show you this. This is some fancy stuff. Input dot get key down key code dot, let's say I, temp bool equals not temp bool. There we go. So that's a lot. That's what I just did. Let's go over this. So if you put an input, which is, for example, a keyboard or a mouse click, so anytime that you do something to input an action, then you have get key down. Now there are multiple different ones. There's get key down, and get key up. Get key down is when you press it. That's a single instance. Get key up is when you lift it. When you lift it, that's another single instance. And there's get key. Get key is as long as you hold it down. Then key code just says, hey, I'm accessing the key codes. This is, I want it to be a letter, a mouse click, or a numerical value, or some button on the keyboard or mouse or whatever. And then the dot just allows you to move forward with the function, or with the functionality, and then you declare what it is. In this case, I have an I, so when I hit the I button, the temp boolean is going to equal not the temp bool. The exclamation mark says not, so it's a negator or the opposite or whatever. So for example, at the temp bool here, if the boolean is true, then it's going to equal not true, which means false. If the boolean is false, it's going to equal not false, which is true. So that's how that goes. And then we're going to have it, let's say debug.log, and we're going to do temp string. So let's actually get rid of this. And here at the very start, it's going to tell us what the temp string is, which is should be, let's change this. There you go. I'm a silly string. There we go. That will be the beginning. That will be at the very beginning. Once we hit the play button, that's going to show up in the console. Now, then we declared that the temp bool was false. Because down here, if it's false, it's the integer. And that's fantastic. Then it's going to change the value of the string. So that's going to be this. It's going to show this at first, then it's going to declare what the variable is, and then it's going to change the string. Next, we're going to hit the I button, and it will change the boolean to true, which then should change the string to a float. So let's go ahead and hit play. If I'm correct, all this is going to work. And oh, look, I'm a silly string. Now if I hit the I button, boom, the integer, it's the integer because, well, as I hit the I button. So let me get this collapse off. You can't really see it that well. You can see over here, there's multiple, I gotta get in the scene. There's multiple instances you can see in counting. That's how many times that this is happening. So there we go. We've got that. So let's make it actually just a little bit easier to read. This is what I mean by once you're running with multiple things, we know the values, we know what's going on, but let's go ahead and make it so that it's a lot easier. Um, Actually, the float value is, we'll add that space and we'll close it, and we want that plus. Copy paste. The integer value is blah blah blah. There we go. Save it and test it. So I'm a silly string. It says the integer value is 5. The float value is 1.75. And you can see over here on the console, there we go. So yeah, those are the basic functionality. This is how you test everything. You set up your conditions, you set up your debug.log, and you put your trigger to make sure that it's all working. That'll all make a lot more sense later on. But debug.log is your friend. It will be your best friend. And those are the core 4 uh, variables. Okay, so now that we have created our empty variables, we've run some basic start functionality, and we've run our runtime functionality. Let's go ahead and simplify this. This is one of the most important things you could do. Let's go ahead and get rid of these debug.logs. They're actually not going to be important now. In fact, we can get rid of this temp string. And, oops, I deleted too much. There we go. All right, so let's create a function. Now we want to void because we don't want to return extra data. We want to empty after, once it runs it. Void, let's say setup. Now we're going to put in empty parameters for this function. We don't want anything fancy with it. That's going to be, remember the parameters, is going to be the parentheses, and then we have our squiggle lines to contain our data. Let's go ahead and cut this down from here and put it here. Now, right now, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to set any values because we haven't called the function. So let's make sure in our void start that we call this function. There we go. So what this is going to do is once it starts, it's going to run the exact same code that we created before, but now it's in this nice little clean setup thing. So when you're working, you can put setup at the very bottom of the script, and what that does is it just cleans up your script. I know it doesn't sound too fancy, but when you've got a script that's hundreds of lines, then getting the data that you don't really need to pay attention to down to the bottom, so the stuff that you're working with is more towards the top, that's very helpful. A clean script is always a more efficient and easy to work with script. So essentially this is going to do the exact same thing. I know right now, in this case, it's extra lines, doesn't make any sense, but again, a clean script makes all the difference. Let's go ahead, clean it up, and we'll save it and test it. So there we go. It doesn't say anything, got rid of that line, but if hit I, well, there we go. And you can see it's toggling between the two. And yeah, there we go. I mean, that's the core foundation of a lot of programming. So now we've got a lot of functionality. We've done some cleaning, but let's make it cleaner. And it's really not that hard. So there's actually some fancy stuff you could do, and some of the automatic things that you don't really know, and it's good to know. If you get rid of that, if you just say if temp bool or any kind of boolean, it's going to automatically assume that you're talking about true. So you don't have to do that every single time. That works fine. Now, if you're doing false, you always have to put this. Now, for consistency and easy, I like to do that, like to do this, unless I only have, um, if I'm not writing false. But that's what we're going to change to. That's one of the cool things. So let's actually take this false. It's not going to change the script, or it's not going to change the functionality, but I'm going to make it a little easier. So it says the same thing. But let's make it into an if-else statement. So it's going to be if it's this, do this, else do this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do that. So if the temp boolean is true, then temp string equals the float value is, and it's going to be the float. Else, so meaning that the temp bool was false, temp string will be this. So we've actually just completely cleaned up our code. Some people like to do this. Actually, I'm kind of a fan of it because I like to have my scripts nice and short. essentially runs the same exact data. But let's go ahead. We're going to save it and we're going to test it. And there we go. It's the exact same thing. So what you're able to do is clean it up, put an if else statement, which means it's going to be this or it's going to be this. There's no other option. But there we go. So just to recap, we created our empty variable. We created our start function, which runs our function that we created that sets up the data at the very beginning. Then we have our runtime functionality, which says if the tempo is true, the string equals this. Else, the string equals the integer. And then we put our button to create the functionality that we can control. Hey, this is what we want to happen. So we have our trigger right here. We have our functionality here. And then we have our setup data right here, which is based off of our empty variables. There we go. That's the core foundation to programming. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please click that like button, and I look forward to making more of these with y'all. If you guys have any suggestions or some or questions or anything like that, let me know. I'd be more than happy to program and show you guys if I was going to be able to do it. I will be more than happy to make a video for y'all. I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you guys next time.